The whole corporate structure is changing. We're looking at a decentralization, if you want to call it, of work, of organizations where more things are going to be automated or outsourced, non-core stuff. So I look at non-core, the things that don't generate revenue or don't generate products, okay? So if you're in a support group, finance, legal, human resources, recruiting, you're not core. I think this latest economic downturn or shift is indicative of what's coming, where these huge layoffs have taken place. So I think the big lesson is small is beautiful. We're back to Schumpeter's 1970s economic theories that small is beautiful. And I think what's made that possible is technology.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Kevin Wheeler has studied talent management long enough to know that many answers lie in the past. Kevin is a globally known speaker, author, futurist, and consultant in talent management, human capital acquisition, and learning and development. He's the founder of the Future of Talent Institute, host of the exclusive Future of Talent retreats across 3 continents, and the author of multiple books and hundreds of articles on work and talent acquisition. I've known Kevin for decades and have been privileged to be an attendee or faculty member at more than a dozen of his retreats. I estimate that almost half of my professional community I met directly or indirectly through Kevin's events. In this episode, Kevin and I discuss the largest trends in talent acquisition and employment in their historical context, how work is being decentralized, and the essential skills tech workers will need in the next decade. We also talk about the benefits of a liberal arts degree, changes in global demographics and their effects on work, the relationship between the U.S., China, and other parts of Asia, employees as investors, and other topics. All right, if you enjoy Work for Humans, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now I bring you Kevin Wheeler. Kevin Wheeler, welcome to Work for Humans.
It's great to be here, Dart.
You have held a talent roundtable called Future of Talent Roundtable, or it's the retreat, for 15 years leading up to COVID. And these are, let me just say for listeners what these are. These are very small, boutique, think tank kinds of events that usually take place in some very remote location. The ones in the United States do, someplace on the coast north of San Francisco or something like that. And it's all super deep thinkers and futurists around the future of work. I've been lucky to go to all except one of them. And in those events, you usually show the big trends. What are the big trends and where are they leading into the future? Largely focused on talent acquisition, but also employment overall. What are you seeing today that's in that? And then we'll talk about individual pieces of it.
The trends I'm going to talk about are trends that have been around for a while. They're not new, but they're taking a new importance, I guess, in the world of talent and talent acquisition and work. The big one is obviously artificial intelligence, automation, chat, GPT, whatever you want to call it, however you want to characterize it. AI is not new. I was working in AI in the 80s, but it was primitive compared to what we have today. It's come light years ahead. So that's a major factor that I think anybody listening to this podcast is well aware of. I think the other big trends are really the new way we're working. And, the pandemic accelerated what was already happening. Again, nothing new. One of my favorite sayings, as you know, Dart, is there's nothing new under the sun. They just take new importance or new perspective. New way of working. People were asking for this in survey after survey for the last 10 years. Flexible working time, ability to choose your own hours. And of course, with the pandemic, we went remote completely, and now we're at hybrid. And now the big push is to come back to the office. And we'll see how that plays out. We can talk about that if you want later. New attitudes about work. Younger people, those under 40 for sure have a different perspective about work, I think, than I had, or you probably had or have. We were more 8 to 5 kind of people. Go to the office every day, 40-hour work week. That was kind of norm. Maybe 60-hour work week was not unusual. And young people are saying no to all that. So that's a big shift, big shift. And most companies are led by guys our age, and they're not comfortable with that. So there's big changes going on there. And then recruiting, the whole corporate structure is changing slightly. I think we're looking at a decentralization, if you want to call it, of work, of organizations where more things are going to be automated or outsourced, non-core stuff. So I look at non-core, the things that don't generate revenue or don't generate products. Okay. So if you're in a support group, finance, legal, human resources, recruiting, you're not core. You are not a core function. And those core functions are going to be heavily automated or outsourced to providers that are extremely competent in doing that. So companies are probably going to over time get smaller. Startups are already smaller. Many of them are not going to get as big. I think this latest economic, whatever we want to call it, downturn or shift is indicative of what's coming, where these huge layoffs have taken place, especially in the high-tech companies. I was talking with a company yesterday. They had 320 recruiters, and this was a startup, a small technology startup. And now they have five. And five is probably all they ever needed, to be quite honest. So that vast inflation of hiring people to do work that wasn't really necessary. It was driven by panic, fear that we're not getting the right talent because we need more, throw more people at it. It's kind of like the old adage, throw more programmers at a program. And we learned a long time ago, it doesn't help anything. And I think just throwing more recruiters at it doesn't help anything either. I think we've learned that. So I think the big lesson is small is beautiful. We're back to Schumpeter's 1970s economic theories that small is beautiful. And I think what's made that possible is technology.
So you've always looked at today's work in the sweep of the historical context of the Industrial Revolution and how, in some ways, you see us returning to ways of work that predate the Industrial Revolution. Can you describe some of that?
Yeah, sure. If you look back at your grandfather or your great grandfather, almost nobody worked in a big corporation like we have today. Most people lived on a farm of some sort, or they worked in small, I guess what we'd call cottage industries of some sort, either making things at home or in a very small business with a few dozen employees, maybe 100 people max. That was the way people worked up until the real dawn of real in-depth industrial revolution, where we began to build these huge mega factories that employed, hundreds and hundreds of people. And, in England, they basically had to coerce people to work in these places. They were incredibly unsafe and unhealthy and inhuman. And people were just dragged into these factories. A lot of young boys, young kids, 12 years old. And that was sort of the start of the world that we grew up in, that we knew, which was this big industrialized mass production economy where it took hundreds and hundreds of people to do something, highly specialized skills, all brought under one roof in these deep, vertically integrated organizations. And I think that's shifting back to more what we had. It's not going to be exactly like it was in the 1800s or early 1900s, but it's going to have characteristics similar to that, where people are working more individually, more in small teams, maybe more ad hoc teams, people that come together for a purpose, a project, and then disband, various experts who get together when their expertise is needed and then leave when it's not needed anymore. So I think we're seeing a big shift back to that, really slow. It's not happening as a revolution. It's definitely an evolution. But when we look at a lot of things that are going on today, the way new companies, smaller companies are structuring themselves. I have a friend of mine whose wife is an HR person. All she does is work part-time for these different companies. She has 3 jobs at one time where she's the HR person for 3 companies, right? There's no need to hire a full-time, 40-hour work HR person. So they have on-call people that are needed. Finance can largely be outsourced. You may have a lawyer and retainer. It's just not necessary to have these huge infrastructures that we've built. And in some cases, they'll still be required. It's not going to be completely eliminated, but we're going to see much less of it and a big return back to more individualized cottage industries, if you want to call it that. Smaller businesses, heavily leveraging technology to do the work that used to require a lot of people to do.
It's interesting, the sort of the decorporatization. I've been interviewing, for instance, Rowanna Hennigan, who spoke about digital nomadism. And one of the things I learned from her is that we're starting to build essentially a competitive employment product for people who are gig workers in a way we didn't have it before. For instance, for the digital nomads, there are now schools being set up around the world that share a curriculum, and you can move from school to school as you travel around the world. There are companies that are producing healthcare benefits for people who are digital nomads. And what you see is that some of the things that used to keep people working for corporations are becoming services that employees can buy, workers can buy for themselves and cobble together essentially many of the benefits that you get from a larger corporation.
Yeah, absolutely. We've probably seen the beginnings of this with people on Medicare in America, older people that are cobbling together their own. There's a government scheme, but then they subsidize that with other insurances and other services. So, I mean, there's all kinds of things that are starting, companies that are filling in these gaps, filling in the services that corporations used to do. An interesting side note is that the healthcare system in the U.S. that we have, which is corporate driven for the most part, was a very deliberate strategy. Samuel Gompers, one of the original founders of the unions, wanted the unions to own healthcare. And the U.S. government and the insurance companies lobbied heavily against that and drove it into the companies because the companies knew that with that they could control employees. And they didn't want the unions to have that leverage. It was a major platform that Gompers had in his early drive to unionize, and he lost. So it's interesting how even back then, corporate leaders realized that one of their major powers to hold people in the company is healthcare, and it still is today. How many people would leave their organization if healthcare were free or available globally? A large number of people would leave and certainly would feel less compelled to stay than they do today, especially women. A lot of women with children, a lot of people with kids primarily stay in the workforce because of the insurance schemes. So a lot of things are changing slowly but surely.
That's interesting. I never really thought about the resistance against, for instance, Obamacare in the United States. I always thought it was a resistance against being taxed to support it. But the idea that some of the resistance may have been the desire to keep talent less liquid, less able to move.
Part of it, and the other part was the insurance companies have a lot to lose. So combination of lobbying on both corporate and insurance companies, I think is part of it, and a smaller piece of it, but certainly part of it is that the fear that we'd be taxed for it.
One argument in favor of smaller companies, I've been thinking about how AI might affect software development. And my friends who are in software development are basically saying, I can get 10 times more work done than I used to be able to. The ones who are really starting to leverage this because they've got these enormous sources of code that in things like GitHub and other platforms that they can pull on to assemble code very quickly. And initially, that might drop one of the big drivers of the talent industry, which has been the scarcity of technical talent. It might make that less of an issue. On the other hand, I suspect that we've been constrained in the software that could be developed because the cost was so high. And so we might get more and more very highly specialized software platforms because they're so much cheaper to make. There's going to be a response to the fact that software is going to get cheaper, and that response is going to be to make more of it because we can. I suspect that there's a number of very unexpected knock-on effects to that. I want to ask it in two questions. There's two transformations underway. One is how it's going to transform how companies do talent. But the other part is it's going to transform the talent landscape and who's in demand and who's not. So what do you see coming from that direction?
Well, I've said for quite a long time that AI is probably the largest threat to the technical community that, if you want to call it that, technical talent that there's ever been. I think quite honestly, AI will do probably 70% at least of the coding that's required. which means immediately that we're not going to need anywhere near the number of software coders and developers that we have today. But to your point, we may need more creative people who can decide what programs might be useful and written, and therefore could tap into this technology and this data banks of code that's already been written and modify it or tweak it or change it to create new products. Yeah, I mean, I think that I tell people when they say, "What should my child major in?" I say, well, right now, today, and probably for 10 more years, tech is a good option. But in the long run, over a 20 or 30-year career, it's probably not a very good choice. I think we're going to see a lot more focus on people with eclectic polyglot skills, right? I think that's going to be far more important. Technology is one of those components, but it's also understanding humanities, understanding history, understanding society, sociology, human behavior. These are going to be almost as important, if not more important, than the technology skills. So, when you go to develop a product, let's say you're developing anything, a Tesla car, you have to understand technology to a certain degree, but you also have to understand the buyer's behavior, public acceptance, the legal situation, the environment, all the things around that are equally important to the technology, or maybe even more important than technology. And I think what we've had are entrepreneurs who were focused only on technology and didn't really consider all those other factors very much until later on. And then even now, Google, I think this week, is in court right now over the monopolizing of the search industry, right? And whether that's real or not, I'm not judging that, but I'm just saying if they'd thought about that earlier, it might not be an issue. It might have been something that they could easily have mitigated. So I think that, understanding the bigger picture of things, having a more holistic view of things is going to be critical to be an entrepreneur. And you can't just be a nerd and be successful. You've got to have a lot more than that in your toolbox. And that's why I think just going to college and getting a degree in coding or getting a degree in computer science or in any narrow discipline is probably a mistake. And I think that I would love to see a return to the liberal arts colleges, which are dying, unfortunately, right now, because I think the liberal arts are what's going to be our savior.
You were the vice president of talent of HR for National Semiconductor. This was a time Silicon Valley was quite junior at that time. First of all, did you have a liberal arts background?
Political science, yes.
Yeah. Did it inform your career?
Totally. Totally. I think everything in my career was shaped one way or another by the reading and the studying and the conversations that you have when you study a subject like political science, which is really philosophy, history, law. It's all those things. And I think that was incredibly valuable for me. I wouldn't trade that for anything. And I think of the people, I had roommates studying aeronautical engineering, and I looked at their incredibly narrow world, which was purely math and physics, 99%. And when they graduated, their degree was useless because the space program wasn't hiring anybody at that point. So he ended up being a civil engineer. But I mean, I think it's just limiting. When you have a degree that's so narrow and so focused, you're betting all your money on one thing. You're putting all your chips in one box, and it's very dangerous because that box is very likely to be changed quickly. I think a broad discipline like mechanical engineering or something like that, those are broader disciplines, are useful. But even when you look at those things, I have a friend, he's a structural civil engineer, and he's saying that, 80% of what he learned in school and was proud to do is automated today with CAD systems. Even in engineering, there's data banks of specs, basically. When you run into soil like this and you've got what kind of cement should I use and how much of it should I use, it's already been done. There's databases you can tap into now. So it becomes a different thing than it was 30 or 40 years ago when you were inventing those things, right? So even for them today, a lot of times, if you're building a new home, you just push a button and it draws a blueprint for you that meets all the codes of that city or whatever. So all of these engineering disciplines are becoming heavily automated and augmented, is probably the right word, with technology, which makes you as an engineer smarter more capable, and you don't need a staff of 20 people. You can do it with one or two people. That changes everything. And I think we're just going to see that you're going to need much more than just your technical expertise to succeed.
My friend Jamie Levy, who wrote the book UX Strategies, said that UX designers in particular, are smart people with taste. And taste is one of those things that is super important if you get past the technology. I always say that one of the things that my liberal arts degree got me was the ability to start from a blank page, because I was in the arts. And so, you'd be faced with a blank piece of paper. What are you going to do? And that's something that almost no other kind of training will get you, because every other kind of training is about filling you up, with information.
I think that's really the differentiator between an entrepreneur, an innovator, a liberal arts kind of background or thinker, in that you have to do some of the filling in yourself. If you're an engineer or a technician, it was filled in for you. There's a body of knowledge. There's a structured, a system that you find. And if you get really good at that structure, you're successful. If you're, a good civil engineer or a good mechanical engineer, the math, the rules. You just get a slide rule and a calculator on a piece of paper, and you figure it out, and you build it. But when you go and you design something that's never been designed before, or you create something that's not been created before, it's a whole different synergistic sort of thing, as opposed to an analytic kind of a thing, which is kind of, I think, the big difference. So we're entering a world where being able to put disparate things together is going to be far more important than it has been in the past. And when you look at a Frank Lloyd Wright as an example, was he an architect, an artist? What was he? If you really look at that, you say, there's plenty of architects who just build square boxes. How many Frank Lloyd Wrights are there? Because he was a guy that put together art, color, form, shape, and structure, and invented new things that had never been done, cantilevered things that engineers said couldn't be cantilevered, did things that had never been done before, because he was a creative. Even Elon Musk, whether you like him or hate him, he's a creative.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes is from Peter Drucker, who said, management is a liberal art. And that's the people part of it, right? That's not even necessarily the business part of it. What are you seeing going on in terms of global demographics and how that might be affecting the future of work?
Huge. I think it's it's certainly spoken by various world organizations that are out there. The World Bank and other organizations talk about it all the time, but I still think people really get it. The fact that all the developed world is not replacing its own population, well below replacement. You need 2.1 babies per person to replace the current population. And we're about 1.4 or 5 in the US. Some places in the world are at 0.7, Japan. So we're not replacing our population. And the only way we're increasing it is through immigration. So as you allow, the US has only grown its population through immigration since 1970, not through birth. So when you look at all the developed world, all of Europe, most of Asia, including India and China, there's only a few countries that have an above replacement birth rate. Indonesia is one, some of the Middle Eastern countries, and big parts of Africa. So the only growth areas are really Africa. That's the primary one. And if you look at Nigeria, its birth rate is like seven. It's unbelievable. All right. So, the average person is having in Africa somewhere between 5 and 7 children, as opposed to our 1.4. So the future in terms of manpower, people, are in places like Africa.
I remember during COVID, I was really worried about what was going to happen with COVID in Africa. And it just seemed to be a nothing. And so some scientists went to look at what was going on. And they thought maybe just COVID wasn't moving through the population. It turns out everybody had antibodies to COVID. But it hadn't been an event because the average age was 18 years old. That's shocking average age.
It's unbelievable. Yes. And the other part of the demographics is the average age in most of the developed world is well over 40, some places approaching 50. In Japan, it's 50 over 50. So when you've got a population that's already half lived half its life, and probably 2/3 of its productive life, it's pretty shocking. China is projected by 2050 to have only 750 million people versus 1.4 billion today. So India is similar. More is not better when it comes to people necessarily, unless they're highly educated and so forth. So we've had an advantage because we've had an educated and healthier population in the West and in those other countries that are developed than they've had in Africa. But that's changing pretty quickly. And a lot of entrepreneurism, innovation is coming out of Africa already. You're going to see a lot more of that, I think, in the next decade or two as these 18 to 20-year-olds become, 30-year-olds. So I think the shift in power, intellectual thinking, entrepreneurism is going to shift clearly away from the developed world and start to come out of the undeveloped world. So if you look at where venture capital is going right now, where I don't have any fixed, hard and fast numbers, but clearly they're all looking at those places to develop talent. That's where education is going to pay off the most. That's where, if you have some money to invest, that's where you want to invest it. That's why Bill Gates is putting most of his money into the developed world. Curing malaria and other things that he's doing with his foundation are really all aimed at the undeveloped world. So that's really the future there. The world population, according to the UN, is going to decline, which is good for food supply and sustainability. Slowly decline, but over the next 50 to 100 years, we're going to have fewer people in the world, peaking at about 11 billion probably, and then shrinking back down to about 7 billion. And according to the World Health Organization and others, 7 billion is highly sustainable.
One of the things that's going to come into play here, it seems to me, is which countries are attractive to immigration. Let's take a country like China or a country like India versus a country like the United States. I will tell you that the United States as an attraction for immigration has dropped. And I've heard this from a lot of people who we were thinking of relocating to the United States, whose spouses said, the United States is not friendly to immigrants like it once was. I think the Trump era really turned off a lot of talented, educated people who would otherwise be wanting to come to the United States because they heard the vitriol toward their countries, toward their religions. But still, how is China as an attractor of immigration? How are India as an attractor of immigrants?
They're not attractors. There's no developed country that's an attractor of immigrants. Germany, Merkel pretty much gave up her leadership of Germany over the immigration issue, okay? The Netherlands, all of Europe is opposed to immigration. Brexit was a big reaction to immigration in the UK. We're seeing a pushback on immigration everywhere because it challenges the status quo. It dilutes the dominant population. And because of that, there's tremendous opposition to it. I mean, the U.S. is the only country in the world that's entirely made up of immigrants. And it's pretty amazing. It's the only country. We have always been the beacon for those who are looking for another chance, another place to go. I'm hopeful that our current stance is temporary. We've had these before historically. We've had a couple of other periods where we were very anti-immigration, and then that goes away. And despite being anti-immigration, we're still have allowed in a lot of Afghanis. We've let in a lot of Iraqians. We've let in a lot of people from other countries. So even though it may not be as attractive as it once was to the casual immigrant, and I agree with you there, it's still very attractive to those fleeing disaster and fleeing other things. We're still a safe haven, relatively speaking. And if you look at the Vietnamese population, the Hmong population, the people that have come historically in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years to America, have changed the country significantly. And part of the reason for the backlash against, or the backlash for Trump, is that he's supporting the dominant population that was the dominant population. And they're afraid that we're not going to be the kings anymore. And that's true. We're not. The white guy people are not going to be the kings anymore. It's inevitable. It's just a matter of how long it takes for that to happen. But I have great hope that the U.S. Will remain a beacon for immigrants. I was reading a really good book written by a Yale professor. I can't remember the name of the book. I can look it up. She said, we're the only country in the world where it doesn't matter where you're from. When people say, what are you? You say you're an American.
That's right. Working in high tech, I have a ton of friends from India. And one of the things that always impressed me was that the day they got their citizenship, they would say, I'm an American. And everybody around them would say, yes, you are. And I remember one friend from India pointing out that what she said is, she said, look, you don't have any idea how different the United States is from the rest of the world in terms of its acceptance of immigrants. And in particular, she said, the West Coast of the United States, all the way up and down, she said, is just incomparable in terms of how welcoming it is. And I remember during COVID, no, actually, it was pre-COVID. It was in the beginning of the last administration when we started restricting incoming visas. The protests at the San Francisco airport where everybody was chanting, let them in. And my chief people officer at the time was in that crowd. It wasn't something that she could talk about at work, but it was something she could talk about on Facebook. And I've spoken to people outside of the country who said, we heard both messages there. We heard the message of resistance to immigration, but we also saw that protest.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, you go, I go all over the world. You go to Thailand, I could speak fluent Thai. I do speak Thai. I could live there permanently, and I would never be Thai. I would never be Chinese. I would never be Japanese, okay? But I could be American, just no matter what my race or background was. And that's a huge differentiator.
Not only that, your family could be there for 5 generations, and you'd still never be Chinese. You'd still never be Japanese.
Kind of off on a tangent there, but I think that's an important differentiator for the U.S.
It is. I mean, with these demographic shifts, it's something where countries need to think about their brand and how they manage that. In the United States, the NAFTA agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States means that demographically, from a work perspective, we can be kind of considered a bloc. The United States is declining in terms of its demographics and the young people, but Mexico's doing great. And so pushing a lot of work to Mexico is super likely. Friendshoring is also one of the things that I think is a big deal now.
And they're just about to elect their first female president.
Yeah, that's right. You've spent a lot of time in China, a lot of time in Asia, and you've been very bullish on Asia and its growth. And also its mindset that was so forward-thinking, modern. Are you still as bullish as you were?
Yes, I am. Well, let me just back up and say China's going through an interesting period of time. I think there's always these growth spurts, and then everything gets ahead of the psychology of the leadership or the status quo. I think that's really what's happened in China. Xi Jinping is the new Mao Zedong. He's pushing back into the same sort of mindset as Mao had. How long that will last is a really good question. But generally, the people in China are very progressive, very entrepreneurial, very modern in their thinking. The young people, all very modern in their thinking. And I think there's going to be a real clash. There's an old saying in China that the leader to survive has to have the mandate of the people. And this was from the emperor's way thousands of years ago. When you lose the mandate of the people, you lose the government. And Xi, I think, is treading close to losing the mandate of the people. Not there yet. I think the majority still support him, but time will tell where that goes. He may learn that and relax his stance, change things. But economically right now, things don't look great for China. I don't think the U.S. has shown the greatest amount of statesmanship in how it's dealt with Asia in general. I think we still have a tremendous misunderstanding about Asia. We don't have statesmen anymore that we used to have. I think that's probably one of the things we lack as a country are deep thinkers about and historians about Asia that understand it and are influential in government. We have people who just react in the short term. And that's not only Trump, it's others in our government. So I think you have to look at things in a more broader historical perspective. I don't think we quite understand the psychology between Taiwan and China. The election is about to occur in Taiwan, and the person who looks likely to win is pro China, which is quite interesting. Pro joining China in some capacity. So, it's not black and white. It's not just everybody in Taiwan hates China and so forth. There's a lot more nuanced discussion that we need to have. And we in America just see everything in black and white, us or them. It's nothing in the middle. And I think that's a real danger. Singapore is much better at statesmanship. They can tread multiple paths at the same time. And I think that's, again, part of our technology-oriented thinking as opposed to a more broader, liberal, historically driven thinking. So, ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, just had their summit in Indonesia this week. Huge amount of discussion over Myanmar, the old Burma. Do we invite Burma to join the ASEAN or not? Huge discussion. They didn't invite them, but it was a big controversial discussion. And even though they're a totalitarian, oppressive state, what's the best way to deal with it? Is it I call it the European way, where you isolate them and segment them, or is it a more Asian way where you become their friend and change them from the inside out? So different philosophies of life. I think the East and the West are very different, obviously, philosophically, and we don't really, I think Asia understands us better than we understand Asia.
What would statesmanship look like? Good statesmanship.
People are not going to agree with me completely on this, but I think Nixon and Kissinger, despite where we may think about Nixon personally or domestically, he was a very intelligent man in international politics. You go to Asia, he's the most respected U.S. president, which is pretty interesting. And you ask him why. He said, because he understood us. Kissinger just recently returned at 90-something to China?
101.
101, right, and was welcomed in. We had a Galbraith as our ambassador to Japan at one point. We had some really good, deep thinkers that were ambassadors, or we had Kennan, which architected the whole Cold War strategy with Russia. These were deep thinkers who understood Russia really well, who understood Japan really deeply, who could advise and counsel presidents and policies. And I just don't think we have that today. I think we've got a very, I don't know the right word exactly, a group of diplomats that we may have them, but they're not in influential positions. I think we do have some deep thinkers in the diplomatic corps, but they're sidelined. And I think the ones that are in the core or in the forefront are not very well informed or very deep thinkers about Asia, or maybe even about Africa and other places as well.
You and I have sometimes debated who employees really are in relation to a company. And I want to bring that up because people who listen to the show know my position, which is that I position employees as customers. And I think you have a very solid argument for another version of that. And I want to bring it out on the table. How do you position employees in relation to companies?
I've always taken a front at the term employees are our most important asset. And I think the word asset is something you describe to things that can be depreciated, appreciated, discarded, written off. And I really believe that's how we've treated employees in America almost forever, but certainly from the 80s on, when that phrase started to be used. I look at employees as investors. And I look and I say, I have a set of skills. And I want to invest those skills, just like I would invest money, in something that gives me a return for my investment. And that return can be anything from money to financial to just personal satisfaction. So I look around at the various companies out there and I say, wow, I'd really like to work for Apple because they're doing wonderful stuff for the world. They're making really cool technology products. I love their design and innovation. They pay well, blah, blah, blah. So I decide I invest my skills. I go and apply at Apple. I invest my skills in Apple. And I expect that Apple will give me something in return, either give me that kind of satisfaction or give me a great working environment, great pay, treat me like a human, whatever it is I'm looking for as an investor. And I think what's happened in the last decade or two is I haven't gotten any return on my investment. I invest and they treat me like crap. They may pay me well, but I know that they're doing that just to golden handcuff me, not because they care about me. Why does Silicon Valley give all these perks to employees? Just so I'll work 80 hours a week and have no excuse to go home. Why would you want to go home when everything's right here? A bed, a dentist, a doctor, a haircut, free food. Why would you need anything else? So we're back to the old company towns like Pullman, Washington, where you were basically a captive of that town and you bought all your groceries from the company store and they owned your credit so you couldn't really leave. That's what we're creating again. So I think what's happened in America is we have not given employees any return on their investment. And I think that term asset just underlies the philosophy that management has, that people are just digits, and no matter how much they say they respect you, the minute money comes into the consideration, you're no longer important.
So I didn't want to compare and contrast what happens when you think of investor versus customer. One of the things I like about the word investor is that it implies a longer term relationship, which is this idea that I'm going to invest and my investment is going to mature over time. It's something about that. And so I think there's something real there, which is because customers flit around a little more. They're a lot less loyal, but investors, it's probably not true. There's probably short-term investors and long-term investors.
I just take a look at a company like General Electric or IBM historically. Those are companies that had virtually no significant turnover. They hired almost nobody mid-career, and people stayed their whole life. When you said I'm an IBMer, you were proud to say that.
I can vouch for that, by the way. I used to try to recruit out of IBM, and it was impossible to recruit out of IBM. And I could recruit out of any company, but I would call somebody at IBM and they would, nicest people ever, but they were like, to them, my whole pitch was incomprehensible. They're like, no.
Yeah, it was family. My wife worked there for 40 years. Amazing. Hard for me to even believe. She could never understand me and working in the semiconductor industry. And the things that, she said, my son is sick. I'm going to take 3 days off. Okay. I said, I can't do that. I can't do that, but she could do that. It was family. They took care of you. They sent her back to school for 2 degrees, all paid for. And they expected you to stay your whole life. And it was great. It was voluntary, but nobody wanted to leave because, as you just said, it was a long-term investment. And the payoff was a great work life and a good career. And we don't have that anymore. Now, you might get fired tomorrow. You might get laid off tomorrow. For the first 30 or 40 years, IBM and HP, they all had no layoff policies. And that didn't change until the 80s, when suddenly shareholder profit became the only important thing.
That's part of the reason why, when the idea of employees being investors was first floated. And I remember Thomas Davenport. It was an important thing to say because companies were so focused on shareholders at the time that saying that there was another investor in the field and that investor was employees and that they should be treated as significantly as shareholders, I think was a counterbalance to that.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a real, the 80s were a very significant decade in America's corporate life. This was the age of, I think Soros was his name, the guy that started to really sue companies if they weren't totally focused on shareholder value. And if you weren't maximizing the profits to the shareholders, you were an evil company. This was the age of re-engineering, redesign. I went through this many times in my career. Zero base everything, fire everybody who's not critical, hollow out middle management because they're just a waste of resources. These were the characteristics and the hallmarks of the 80s. And it changed the corporate world completely for the bad, for the negative, in my opinion. Yes, it increased shareholder value. Yes, stock prices and returns on your financial investments went up. Your return on your personal investment as an employee went way down. And you lived in an age of total uncertainty as to whether you're going to have a job tomorrow. Constantly were worried about, layoffs and downturns and the whole scheme of things. How do I brown nose enough people so that I don't get laid off? So politics became key, and how well you play the political game. So I'm not in the line of getting laid off.
Yeah. When fear goes through a company, and I've seen it happen where all of a sudden people become afraid and they become risk averse and there's all these different things that happen. Very damaging to a culture. And I think if you were to measure how long that damage lasts, it lasts from layoff to layoff for sure. Even if the layoffs are like 8 years apart, it's a really damaging thing.
It's like a sword hanging over your head. You know someday it's going to come down. It's just a matter of when and whether it's going to hit me or not.
One of the things that you speak about when you speak about employees as investors, that is, I haven't quite heard. I mean, maybe I heard it before and I was just too deep in my debate mode to really hear at the time. But the idea that as investors, we want more back than just money. So that's one of the things about the framing employees as investors, is that an investor puts in money, gets out money. But this investor that you're talking about puts in skills and gets back a lot more than money.
You get back a whole combination of things. Back to IBM again. You get friendships. You get connectivity with other people. You get learnings, deep learnings, because you watch people progress through their career. So you saw how they did things and you learn. You know, the middle management was the greatest training organization that we ever created. It was having extra people you didn't really need because you had an assistant to an assistant. But that assistant to an assistant was learning skills that would be very valuable as they moved into the next job in the company, right? So so the other thing you got was education and learning. You got a career progression that you knew you were going to, have something new or different to do. You knew you could switch around in the company and move to another area, and the company would support that. You could go back to school and the company would support that. So just all sorts of intangible benefits that came from it.
Is that forbidden today by boards, essentially? I mean, what's the force that's keeping that from happening today?
Well, first of all, you've got fairly short-term employment. Very few people work in a company for more than 10 years, max, right? Generally much less than that. So you don't get that learning curve. And you're usually in an area where there isn't a person senior enough to you that you're really learning from them. In many cases, you feel I know as much or more than that person knows. They're just my boss. I think in those other companies, your boss was far more skilled and capable than you were in almost every case. And so you really felt you were looking up to somebody and learning from them, as opposed to, this is just another peer of mine, and I'm as good or better than he or she is. I think today it's really hard, partly for that reason, partly because we didn't replace that education with anything. Very few companies have really good formal education programs. And if they do, they're usually reserved for an elite group of, the senior managers or something like that. You don't just get lots of good basic training in organizations. I mean, when I was in the corporate world, we had things like introductory management training. We had supervisory training. We had really basic stuff that helped you build skills and learn how to do things better. That's pretty much gone. Very few companies have that today. They expect you to come in already skilled. And that's the other thing. We don't hire entry-level people. It's really hard to get a job as a new college grad today. Only a few elite companies bring in a few, right? So there's no training ground. Where are these companies going to get new people if they're not willing to train anybody at the entry level?
I see a different pattern. I'm in a subset of the economy. But the pattern I see is hiring lots of people who are young and very, very smart. And then saying, you're so smart, figure it out yourself. And so not giving anyone the training or the tools. And part of that is a distrust of received wisdom from the past. It's this idea that anybody might have learned, 40 years ago is irrelevant. Some of that has to do with the pace of technological change, which is that senior managers don't keep up with the technological change. And so they do fall behind. And the companies that I have seen do a lot of this work are heavily relying on raw intelligence to figure things out.
And I get that. And I'm not, and I believe me, I'm not necessarily an advocate or a fan of going back to IBM 1960. Okay. That was a model that worked really well then. I agree with you. I'm not sure with the pace of change that replicating that exact model would be a good thing for corporations to do. But I do think that we disrespect history today and we disrespect the past way more than we should. And I think that, a programmer from 10 years ago can probably teach a young person a whole lot about maybe not about the code itself, but about the process of coding and about the thought process that goes into coding. That would be really, really valuable for that young person to learn. Okay. Rather than wasting time rediscovering what that person already knows and can teach. Right. So I think it's about respecting the past enough. I really like that movie with De Niro when he becomes what's the name of that
The
movie?
Intern. Is it The Intern?
The Intern. Yeah, I think that is. I mean, it's a really good example of a retired 60 some odd year old guy going into a startup and bringing in a maturity level and a sophistication that they completely lacked. And even helping the CEO think through things. And that's only a movie, but I think it was really well done in that it shows a way that those older employees can add something to even the most brash startup. And of course, the young, brilliant startup guy doesn't want to listen to that. They don't want to listen to dad because what does dad know? But I think it's important to be humble enough to listen to the advice of those who have gone before judiciously and not taking everything, but carefully listening and learning what you can from them. And I think we tend to discard people when they get old or older. I see layoffs where we say there isn't job age discrimination, but believe me, I've been there and I've seen it. And even though it may be ostensibly skill, it fundamentally is age discrimination. And I think that's really a shame that we do that.
Well, and with the demographics the way they are, we might have to stop.
Well, I think you're right. We probably will have to. And to your point, you work in a company that has always hired young, smart people. That's not necessarily the case for many other companies. There's three kinds of hiring I look at. There's the companies like Google and Apple and others that hire what they call the A players. And the A, B, everybody's an A or a B. But that's only for a unique set of companies, mainly in high tech. And I think that model is warped right now. Then there's the group that almost anybody can do the job. That's your manufacturing, that's your mass hiring. That's like anybody. There's a third set, which is emerging in a lot of the startup world, which is where we need more of this polyglot, this more broadly educated, more broadly experienced hire, which isn't an A or B player anymore. We're not hiring A and B players. We're hiring a broader kind of person. So we've got three different hiring models out there right now today. And I think we all get hung up on this A-B model, which only applies to a very small number of very big dominant companies. And I don't think it's a good model, but it's a model that's been around for a while. But I really think the one that's going to win and dominate is the one at the bottom. The one in the middle will be automated to a large degree. And the one at the bottom is really the emerging new companies, most of whom we don't even know who they are yet.
I'm going to tell a story of my friend's son because I think his story fits that model really well. He studied music in college. He came out with that degree, loves music, great composer, does music tracks for movies for free, essentially. Comes out, works in a restaurant for a while, COVID hits. He teaches himself how to code during COVID. He took some coding classes in college, and he really enjoyed them. His professors loved him because he was there for fun. He liked to code. So he teaches him how to code. Company hires him. He becomes the manager of DevOps in like a year and a half. He's the manager of DevOps. Doesn't like it. Leaves and becomes an EMT. He gets certified as an EMT and he becomes an ambulance driver. And that's what he's doing right now. He'll probably go back into high tech at some point. But look at how that worked, which is he had this broad liberal arts degree. He was able to teach himself how to code on his own, given the resources that are available today. And went into the work environment, didn't like it, and despite the promotions and the new money, and walked away.
It's a more and more common model. We have a family friend, he's a musician as well, a coder, all self-taught. He creates wind chimes and tunes them. He plays the piano, the organ, and numerous other instruments. An accomplished programmer. He's written several apps for the iPhone, and he just recently got hired at Lawrence Livermore Labs as I don't know what, something in coding, okay? But he doesn't really like it, so who knows how long he'll be there. And he's helping his wife create, and her father create a company selling battery backup devices, a new kind of battery backup technology. So very polyglot, very multi-skilled, self-learners. And I think that's that third and growing category of young people. And they're starting companies and working in companies that are very different than the ones you and I have worked in.
I want to ask you a few questions before we close. You know my standard questions because you've heard the show. But also, one of these questions I started asking originally in one of your roundtables in the Future Talent Retreat, which is, what job do you, Kevin, hire your job to do for you?
Right now, at this age of my career, I hope to help other people by mentoring, coaching, sharing a little bit of what I've learned over the past. That's my job right now as I see it. I really enjoy just sharing whatever I can, whatever anybody wants to know. If I know it, I will try to share it. Coach, mentor, guide. That's really my job right now.
And you do it incredibly globally, which is that you have roundtables like the one I've attended in California all over the world.
Yeah, we just did one in the Netherlands in May. We're doing one in November in Australia. I think it's not just sharing my knowledge, getting other people to share their knowledge and contribute to a broader discussion about all the issues we've been talking about today and get a different perspective on work and on their own career and where they're going.
One of the things that those roundtables always showed me was the variation in situations that different companies are in, and just seeing different perspectives from different companies in different industries from different parts of the world and what they were facing was incredibly valuable, because you get very sort of zoned in on your own industry and you think that's the universe. And there's all these assumptions that are baked into your own industry and you think that's the universe. And to see those assumptions broken up was always super valuable.
That's my other sub job, challenging assumptions. And that's what I really like to do. I think we carry a ton of assumptions around, especially in the talent world, most of which are untested and unverified. But nonetheless, we think they're the truth.
Yeah. There's a lot of what I consider very naive assumptions about how work works. Yeah. And the way that you challenge the assumptions is looking historically at how things have been different in the past. There's different ways to look at our assumptions. And one is to compare and contrast with other countries, to compare and contrast with other industries, and to compare and contrast with different times in history. And that's always been a super valuable combination of things to bring to the table. What does your job cost you?
Nothing. Time. That's all. Time. Other than that, nothing.
I have found that the more self-employed people are, the less their job costs them, which is very interesting because they've been able to craft it to meet their own needs.
Yeah. I'm very happy with what I can do and what I don't have to do, right?
Where can people learn more about you and your work?
You can go to our website, which is just thefutureoftalent.org, or you can subscribe to my newsletter, the FOT newsletter, which is a free weekly publication. Those are the two best places to learn more.
And are you speaking at the Australian Talent Council in November?
Yes, I am.
You and I both. So if anybody happens to be in Australia at the time, you and I will both be speaking at the Australian Talent Council, ATC, which is going to land right on the last week of November. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
You're welcome, Dart. Always great. Always fun.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.